Just another quick further analysis of this track to point out some other glaring inconsistencies. Now, many years ago, I had a class in college in physics and remember doing a lot of problems about if you had a certain force moving in a certain direction versus another force in another direction, calculating resultant vectors. And it was a giant headache. And common sense tells you that if something larger moving faster hits something smaller moving slower, the thing moving slower and smaller is going to get the worst end of it. That's just basic common sense. Everybody out there knows that. Now, but just to put this track in perspective, this is about, it's 1625 UTC. UTC is basically Greenwich, England time, and Japan, this area, is 9 hours plus that. So this is about 1:30 in the morning right here when it's reporting this location. So this is where they're alleging the collision took place. This collision was so violent that the 29,000-ton ship did a 90-degree turn. Now they're saying the ship was on autopilot. The ship was on autopilot, and this change in course is a result of the collision. Can you imagine the change in course felt by the people on the destroyer, who we know were moving slower? How do we know they're moving slower? Because the report was that it was on roughly a parallel course to the container ship and being overtaken by the container ship from behind, meaning that 18.5 knots was greater than the velocity of the destroyer. Now, on this other track here, the EaseNet, after the turn, it has this thing doing 14 knots, 14.4 knots an hour later. Here, so from here to here, this loop represents an hour at 14 knots. Okay, you with me? So somewhere between 14, it was moving 18 knots, dropped to 14 knots. We'll just use the 14 knots number. That's roughly about 15 miles an hour. So we can say that this track here represents about 15 miles. So we can say that, this is about 9, this is about 6, something like that. Maybe this is, 10, this is 5, however you want to look at it. But roughly, that's the distances we're talking about here. The size of the ship, the container ship, the Crystal, 700 feet long, moving at 14 knots, would have taken, from the time the bow hit the destroyer to the time the aft of the ship, the stern of the ship, reached that point in the water, would have been almost 30 seconds. Now, I'm not saying that somebody would have had time to run up to the bridge and look and be able to look right over the edge and see the ship or what was left of it going by. But within a matter of minutes, I would have to say, if the shock of the impact was so great that it knocked this thing's 90 degrees off its course, woke a few people up, if everybody was asleep and this thing was on autopilot, I guarantee within 4 to 5 minutes somebody was on the deck looking over the rail trying to find something. And 5 minutes, since we said this entire track here to here is an hour, well, we can divide that by about 12, and we can say that by about here we had human beings awake and looking around. Now, if they were running on a parallel course here and smacked into something much larger, 4 times as heavy, moving faster, you can say their resultant vector would have been over here somewhere. At least over here somewhere. It wouldn't have been way back here. That's for sure. So, if it wasn't on autopilot, then we know they're lying. If this turn is not a result of the impact, then it's a manual course change. That means they're already lying. If it is the result of the impact, then if this thing did 90 degrees to its right, this thing would have done at least 90 degrees to its left, if not more. And that would have put it way the heck up here. Now, when we look at this other track, it's saying that this track put him here at 2:25 local time. Remember, +9. And this is when the Coast Guard said they got the call that they hit something. Almost an hour later. Now, this isn't some giant, this isn't 50 or 100 or miles here. This entire track from here to here was done at 14 knots, roughly about 15 miles an hour. The entire location of where all this was completely visible to this container ship through this entire track. All the way through here. This ship would have ended up here. They could have visually made confirmation anywhere in here, but they waited until here to make the call. That's why this doesn't add up, folks. It doesn't add up. The track doesn't add up. And even if that was the case and the ship would ended up out here, if they were coming back to render assistance, why do they track all the way back past where the accident allegedly occurred? If the destroyer had been going this direction, the damage would be on the port side. You'd have port-to-port damage. That's why they would have come over here. But it wasn't. It was damage on the starboard side. So it was, they were beside each other, traveling roughly the same direction. We've established this. They wouldn't have had a reason to come all the way back here and then do this giant looping left hand to make a right hand turn thing. If that ship was out here somewhere. So, just the who's, the what's, and the wherefores, we don't know, but we do know that they're lying. Because physics doesn't agree with what they're saying. If the ship wasn't on autopilot, then we know they're lying. If that's why this turn was made. If this change in direction was simply as a result of the collision, this track completely falls apart for their story tracking back to render aid and assistance. And honestly, what assistance is, how many guys are on a container ship? A couple dozen? You've got a U.S. Navy destroyer with 300 people on board. What are they going to do? It just doesn't even stand to reason. And besides, here, like we said, collision, right-hand turn, within 5 minutes, we would have had let's say even 10 minutes. That puts them here. They're only a matter of a mile away, maybe a couple miles away. At this point, they should be able to see them at that point. And here we can clearly see that they can do maneuvers like this once they have their ship slowed down. Here, it's looking like this collision didn't slow this ship down at all. Did 90-degree turn at 18.5 knots. Seems a bit odd, but not a sailor. Maybe somebody can enlighten me about a container ship that can do a 90-degree turn at 18.5 knots. I've seen pictures of a destroyer doing a pretty hard turn, but I don't know that container ship, especially if they're alleging that it takes them this long to turn on the brakes to make this kind of a turn. So, and put on the brakes figuratively, speaking. So anyway, that's just all I have to add at this point. Thank you everyone for coming to the videos. I sure appreciate it. I'm humbled by everyone in the conversation. Like, share, subscribe, and as I get more information, I'll put it out. Thanks.